Hello, everyone. Welcome to this episode of Sabbath Worship with Ben. Hope it's a blessing and you all enjoy it. This week we'll be discussing the promised land that's all throughout the Bible story. This week I was inspired to talk about the promised land over the course of the Bible. So, throughout the Bible, the promised land is a central theme, especially in the Old Testament. So it all starts back when God called Abraham out of the land with his father and told him to go to a special place where Abraham didn't know anyone. And God promised him that if he went, that he would be given this land and that he would have it for all of his generations to come, and that it would be his property and that it would be given to him by God. Says God was God's promise to Abraham, hence the name the Promised Land. So Abraham, of course, went with Sarah and his family, and they traveled all the way to the land of Canaan, from where the land of Ur, I believe it was. So when they arrived, of course, they started to live there, and all throughout Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the Israelite people lived in Canaan, God's promised land to Abraham, where his generation could forever stay. However, they left this land, Jacob and his family, to avoid a great drought that was going through the region at the time. And of course, Joseph was in Egypt. His brothers had sold him into slavery, but he saved them, and they were all brought into Egypt. However, the new Pharaoh came after the brothers and Joseph died, and didn't remember what had been done, so he put the Israelites in slavery. Then God raised up Moses to rescue the people and to take them back to the promised land. And here's where our story gets more interesting. So, the original journey only took a few months before the Israelites reached Canaan, where their land Abraham had been promised was. So it could have taken a much more direct route, but God didn't want the people to be fighting or intermingling with the many other nations along the way who would try to stop them from getting to Canaan. So eventually, even though the people grumbled and complained, they reached the land, and Moses sent out a spy from each tribe to go and scout it out. Of course, is the story of the 10 and 2 spies. 10 of the spies returned, wielding trouble, O tale of woe, told of the giant cities, the giant men who roamed the land, how small they were compared to them. They made it sound like was impossible. If you listen to their report and you can read it in the first books of the Bible, in Numbers or Exodus, I believe it is. It actually kind of sounds like a fairy tale. So, however, there are 2 spies, Joshua and Caleb, who brought back fruit and treasure and harvest from the land, and they promised the people that God would be with them and would take them through the land, that they would be able to go because God was with them. However, the people ignored this truthful report and grieved and woed because of what the 10 spies had said. In fact, they were ready to ditch Moses and to get their own leader to return to Egypt. And when Joshua and Caleb continued to protest, they almost stoned them to death. So God was very angry that the people wouldn't listen to the good report and instead had chosen to abandon this so quickly after God had led them through all this tribulation, led them out of Israel, and now they faced a little difficulty. They were ready to turn tail and leave before they had even tried to start. So God made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years because of this great failure. But eventually the new generation did enter Canaan, and the promised land was once again reclaimed. So over the course of the years, many nations would trouble Israel, as we saw in Judges. Israel managed to maintain their land all the way throughout the time of the judges, the prophets, and the kings. But finally, in the end of the Jewish and Israel king's reigns, Israel was taken away by Assyria and scattered, and Judah was taken away by the Babylonians several years later and was put in captivity. This was all predicted by the prophets because of Israel's stubbornness, just like their forefathers, their refusal to listen to God. So once again, Israel was removed from the promised land. But God promised that if they turned from their ways, they would return. After 70 years, way was opened so that they could return home. And that's where they continued up until Jesus came. So Jesus' coming introduced a whole new aspect to the idea of the promised land. So whereas before it had been the physical land of Israel, physical Israel, now it was spiritual Israel was the issue. God stopped dealing with Israel and instead dealt with the entire world. So we've all been saved through Jesus Christ. So now it brings us to the issue of what does all this mean for us? So the promised land for us is heaven, so to speak. God has promised in Jesus. He says that he was gone to prepare a place for us. It's our reward and it's our goal, and that's where we'll be heading. Of course, our goal is to know Jesus, to have a relationship with him, and to get to truly know him and to share his spirit with others. But to have the promise of heaven and a reward and home. It's like the Israelites were always wanted to go home whenever they were separated from their land that God had promised them. It was their homeland, and even to this day, and even though there's many disputes over it, they have remained there still, in the land that God promised them. But now the important promise is what God has promised to everyone, not physical land on this earth that will pass away, but spiritual real estate up in heaven. And so that's the promise that we have as Christians, as spiritual Israel. And that's our goal. It's a reminder for us to not be like physical Israel because they forfeited the land, and even to this day, they can't keep a claim on it. Other people also give their claims. So even to today, they're struggling to keep the land simply because they failed to trust God or listen to his prophets. So now we have Jesus instead of the prophets. We have Jesus as our friend and our comforter, but we need to listen to him and to follow his guidance, otherwise we'll end up just as physical Israel did, in a deprived state spiritually, and we'll end up losing our spiritual promised land. It's a reminder from the Israelites, another reminder similar to last week, that when we disobey God and when we ignore his warnings, that it never ends well, because God has our best interest in mind and God cares for us. So let's remember this week and this new year to trust in God, to have Jesus as our comforter, our savior, and our friend, and to lay our claim on the spiritual promised land that we have in heaven. That's all I have for this week. Hope it was a blessing, and I hope you all will have a blessed Sabbath. Bye.